There is a moment, and it does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself with the dramatic clarity of a decision consciously made, where something inside the empath simply stops. Not breaks, not hardens, not closes in the way that hurt tends to close people, when the closing is really just pain wearing the costume of strength, something quieter than any of those things. Something that is less like a door slamming and more like a tide going out. Gradual, natural, following a rhythm that was always present underneath the reaching, underneath the interpreting, the hoping, the generous and exhausting work of trying to build a bridge to someone who kept dismantling their end of it in the night. The stopping is not anger, though anger may have visited. It is not indifference, though it can look like indifference from the outside, particularly to someone who had grown accustomed to the empath's pursuit as a kind of background condition of the dynamic. It is not giving up in the way that phrase implies defeat. It is the arrival of clarity after a long, disorienting residence in fog. And when that clarity arrives, when the empath finally, fully, without residual negotiation with themselves about whether one more attempt might produce a different result, stops chasing, everything that was in motion shifts. The entire field of the dynamic rearranges itself. And what becomes visible in that rearrangement is something neither person in the dynamic fully anticipated. To understand why the stopping changes everything, it is necessary to understand what the chasing was doing, not what it felt like from the inside, that is already known, already lived, already archived in the body as a particular kind of fatigue that does not respond to sleep, but what it was doing functionally, what role it was playing in the architecture of the dynamic between an empath and an avoidant. The empath's pursuit was, among other things, a regulation mechanism for the avoidant, not in a way the avoidant consciously designed or deliberately maintained, but functionally, practically, in the way that systems develop their dependencies without anyone planning them. The avoidant's nervous system had learned, through the repetition of the pattern, through the reliable arrival of the empath's reaching after every withdrawal, that the distance was safe, that pulling back did not actually mean losing the connection, that the empath's love was, in a sense, unconditional enough to survive the avoidant's inconsistency without requiring the avoidant to change the inconsistency. The pursuit was, without intending to be, a form of permission, not permission the empath consciously granted, but permission the dynamic created through its own repetitive logic. The message the pattern sent, beneath the level of language, beneath the level of conscious awareness on either side, was this: you can withdraw and I will close the distance. You can go cold and I will bring the warmth. You can make yourself unavailable and I will make myself available enough for both of us. That message kept the dynamic stable. It kept the avoidant regulated. It kept the empathic exhausted. And it kept genuine change, the kind of change that would have required the avoidant to actually reckon with the pattern rather than simply wait for its consequences to be absorbed by the other person. Perpetually unnecessary. The empath, it must be said, did not chase from weakness. This is a misconception worth dismantling directly, because it tends to live in the way this dynamic gets described, as though the pursuing party was simply someone who did not value themselves enough to stop, someone whose self-worth was insufficiently developed to recognize the imbalance and exit it cleanly. That is not the accurate picture. The empath chased from love, from genuine, deep, considered love that had the particular quality of being able to hold the full complexity of another person, including the defended, unavailable, fear-driven parts, without reducing them to those qualities. The empath could see, with the specific perceptual acuity that genuine empathy produces, the person underneath the pattern, the one who was capable of more than the behavior was demonstrating, the one whose longing was real even when its expression was absent, the one who, in the unguarded moments, revealed a depth that the defended surface consistently worked to conceal. The empath was not chasing an illusion. They were chasing a reality that was genuinely present but genuinely inaccessible, the real person behind the real wall, the actual depth behind the actual defense. And the chasing was the expression of a love that refused, for as long as it could sustain the refusal, to abandon that reality simply because the avoidant kept choosing to bury it. That is not a character flaw. That is an enormous capacity for love. It is simply a capacity that was being directed into an insufficient space, poured into a container that was not built to hold it, not because the love was wrong, but because the container was the wrong shape. At some point, the empath system registers what the mind has been resisting, not as a thought, initially, as a felt shift, a change in the body's relationship to the reaching, a heaviness that arrives in the extending arm, a resistance that was not there before, a tiredness that is not about effort but about futility. The nervous system, which has been tracking the pattern with considerably more accuracy than the hopeful mind, finally delivers its assessment in terms that cannot be reinterpreted. This is not working. This has not been working. The variable that was supposed to change in response to the love has not changed. The wall that was supposed to soften in response to the warmth has not softened. The person who was supposed to eventually arrive in the fullness that the unguarded moments promised has not arrived. And the love, the real, genuine, substantial love, is being consumed by the chasing rather than nourished by the connection, is being spent on the maintenance of a dynamic rather than the building of something, is flowing consistently and without adequate return in one direction. The empath feels this, and for a period, sometimes a brief period, sometimes an agonizingly long one, they feel it and continue anyway. Because the love is real and the hope is real, and the capacity for belief in another person's potential is, in the empath, genuinely extraordinary in its persistence. But eventually the feeling is louder than the hope, and the chasing stops. What happens in the avoidant when the pursuit ends is one of the most psychologically revealing sequences available in attachment dynamics, and it tends to unfold in a way that surprises everyone, including the avoidant themselves. The first response is frequently relief, and this tends to confuse the empath if they are watching for it. Tends to land as confirmation of the fear that the avoidant never really wanted the connection anyway. That the withdrawal was preference rather than defense. That the distance was desired rather than compulsive. But the relief is not what it appears to be. It is the nervous system responding to the reduction of pressure, the specific pressure of being pursued by someone whose love was consistently, unavoidably illuminating the gap between who the avoidant was showing up as and who the connection was asking them to become. That pressure was real. It was uncomfortable, and its temporary absence produces a genuine felt sense of ease. The relief is real, and it is also the shallowest layer of what is about to move through the avoidant's interior. Underneath the relief, moving more slowly, arriving with less immediacy but with considerably more weight, is something the avoidant did not fully anticipate, something their system had not adequately prepared for, despite having engineered the conditions that produced it: the silence. Not the silence they chose, the managed silence of someone who created distance deliberately, who controlled the terms of the withdrawal, who could feel the empath's presence just beyond the boundary they had drawn. That silence was comfortable. That silence was chosen. That silence had the empath's pursuit as its backdrop, a kind of ambient warmth that the avoidant could remain close to without having to actually enter. This silence is different. This silence does not have the empath's reaching as its background condition. This silence is actual, complete. The silence of a space that is no longer being filled by someone else's love, working overtime to compensate for the avoidant's absence from their own connection. And in that actual silence, the avoidant encounters something they have been, without fully realizing it, using the dynamic to avoid themselves. The empath's pursuit, for all its generosity and all its genuine love, was also, functionally, unintentionally, a way for the avoidant to avoid the full weight of their own interior, because as long as the empath was reaching, the avoidant had something to manage, something to respond to, or not respond to, or create distance from. The dynamic itself provided a kind of occupation, a relational task that, however uncomfortable, kept the avoidant's attention directed outward rather than inward. When the pursuit stops, the outward direction loses its object, and the attention, lacking its habitual destination, turns back toward the source. The avoidant is left alone with the thing they built the entire architecture to avoid being alone with: the genuine, unmediated, unmanaged experience of their own emotional life. The longing that was always present but could be kept at a functional distance as long as the empath's pursuit was available as an external reference point. The grief that was always underneath but could be managed as long as there was a dynamic to manage instead. Without the chase, there is no management available. There is only the interior, and the interior for an avoidant who has never adequately learned to inhabit it honestly is an uncomfortable place to suddenly be required to live. This is when the shift in the dynamic becomes visible from the outside. This is when the behavior that was previously organized around maintaining distance begins in many cases to reorganize itself. Not always dramatically, not always in the form of a direct approach or a clean admission. The avoidant does not typically at this stage suddenly develop the full vocabulary of emotional honesty that the relationship always needed. But something moves. The coolness that was so practiced becomes slightly less practiced. The disinterest that was so convincing becomes slightly less convincing. The certainty that the distance was the right choice, the certainty that was always somewhat constructed, always somewhat effortful to maintain, always requiring the empath's visible distress to feel adequately justified, that certainty begins to develop small, quiet cracks. The avoidant begins to notice the absence with a specificity that the relief phase did not prepare them for. Not the general absence of the connection. The avoidant was always capable of tolerating the general absence of connection, had built a life around tolerating it. But the specific absence of this person, this particular quality of presence, this irreplaceable texture of being with someone who saw clearly and loved anyway, and never once required the avoidant to be less than the full complexity of who they actually were. That specific absence is not something the avoidance system has a prepared response for. It lands differently than the absences that preceded it. It has a weight that the usual management techniques do not adequately address. And the empath, by this point, is somewhere else entirely. Not geographically, necessarily, but interiorly. The empath who has stopped chasing is not the same person who was chasing. The stopping was not just a behavioral change, it was the outward expression of an interior shift that goes considerably deeper than the decision to pursue less. It was the moment the empath chose themselves. Not as a strategy, not as a calculated move designed to produce a specific response in the avoidant, as a genuine, finally arrived at, deeply felt act of self-return. A turning of the extraordinary perceptual sensitivity, the attunement, the emotional acuity, the ability to feel another person's interior with merely their own precision, back toward the self. Back toward the inner life that had been so thoroughly oriented outward, toward the project of the avoidant, that it had been running at a deficit for longer than the empath had fully acknowledged. The empath had been, in a very real sense, living partially outside themselves, spending a disproportionate amount of their considerable emotional resources on the perception and management and hopeful interpretation of another person's interior, while their own interior waited, patiently. Then with increasing insistence, then with the quiet urgency of something that had been waiting long enough. When the chasing stops, the empath comes home to themselves. And what they find there, in the interior that was always rich, always deep, always worth inhabiting fully, is not the emptiness they feared. It is not the unbearable loneliness of a self without the connection that had been organizing so much of its attention. It is spaciousness, the particular, unfamiliar, gradually wonderful spaciousness of a psyche that is no longer spending most of its energy on someone who was not spending equivalent energy in return. The empath begins, in that spaciousness, to remember things, not about the avoidant, about themselves, about what they were like before the dynamic consumed such a significant portion of their attention, about the interests that quietly atrophied during the months or years of focusing through the fog of avoidant inconsistency, about the quality of their own company, which turns out, in the absence of the chronic low-grade anxiety of the dynamic, to be considerably more nourishing than the pursuit-exhausted version of themselves had been able to access. They begin to feel their own life again as something with genuine texture and genuine forward motion, not as the backdrop against which the main drama of the avoidance availability or unavailability was playing out, but as the main event, as the actual substance of their days, worthy of their full presence, deserving of the same quality of attention and care and genuine investment that they had been pouring into someone who could not adequately receive it. This is the change that changes everything, not the avoidance response to the stopping, though that response is real and significant and tends to be considerably more substantial than the avoidance previous behavior suggested was possible, but the empath's return to themselves, the reclamation of the interior life, the reorientation of the empathic capacity, that extraordinary, rare, genuinely remarkable ability to feel deeply and perceive accurately and love without the protective withholding that most people rely on, back towards its rightful primary subject. The empath, fully returned to themselves, is a different presence in the world than the empath who was mid-chase, not because anything essential changed, but because the essential things which were always present are no longer being filtered through the distorting lens of a dynamic that required constant management. The depth is the same, the capacity for love is the same, the sensitivity and the perception, and the particular quality of genuine human warmth that the empath carries, all of that is exactly as it was. But it is no longer being spent. It is being inhabited. There is a profound difference between those two things that only becomes fully visible when the spending stops. And the avoidant, watching this, Feeling this, in whatever way their defended interior allows them to feel things they would prefer not to feel, encounters something that no amount of the empath's pursuit ever produced in them: the genuine weight of potential loss. Not the theoretical loss that was always abstractly present while the empath was chasing, but the actual specific felt in the body recognition that what was available, what was being offered, consistently with the quality of love that the avoidant's own interior knows was not ordinary, is no longer oriented toward them, is oriented now toward the empath's own life. And that reorientation, that simple and profound act of the empath, finally, fully, without residual apology choosing themselves, that is the thing that lands in the avoidant with more force than any pursuit ever did. More force than any expression of need or any demonstration of love, or any patient, generous, hope-sustained reaching across the distance they kept creating. Because pursuit could be managed, distance could be maintained against pursuit, the avoidance system had a well-developed protocol for remaining defended against someone who was actively trying to break through. It does not have a protocol for someone who has simply, quietly, completely stopped trying. And in the absence of the chase, in the specific silence of someone who has chosen themselves over the exhausting project of choosing someone who could not choose them back, the avoidant is left with the most confronting question their defended interior has ever had to sit with. Not do I want this person, they know the answer to that, they have always known, but rather, am I willing to become someone who deserves them? That question does not arrive gently. It does not come with a comfortable timeline or a reassuring answer already attached. It arrives in the full, unmediated, unmanaged weight of what it actually asks. And what it asks is everything. Whether the avoidant answers that question honestly, whether they find somewhere in the defended and complicated interior of themselves the willingness to let the question do what it is asking to do, is something that belongs entirely to them. It is not a question that can be answered on their behalf. Not by the empath's continued presence, not by the empath's absence, not by any external condition or circumstance or demonstration of love that arrives from outside the avoidant's own choosing. The question requires an inside answer, and inside answers, for the avoidant, are the most demanding category of response available. Because inside answers cannot be deflected outward, cannot be managed through behavior that creates the appearance of engagement, while the interior remains untouched. Cannot be resolved through the usual mechanisms of distance and distraction, and the quiet, practiced art of making the uncomfortable thing feel less urgent by simply not looking at it directly. The empath's stopping stripped those mechanisms of their primary function, because the mechanisms were, in significant part, responses to the empath's pursuit. Ways of managing the pressure of being loved with that quality of consistency and depth. And now that the pressure has changed, now that it is no longer organized around reaching toward the avoidant, but around the empath's own returning to themselves, the mechanisms are running without adequate targets. The defense is deployed, but there is nothing to defend against in the familiar sense. No pursuit to create distance from, no warmth to ration a response to. No hope to manage and parcel out in quantities small enough to maintain the avoidant's sense of control over the dynamic. There is simply the question, and the silence, and the specific, unfamiliar, deeply uncomfortable weight of having to decide something real. The empath, meanwhile, is not waiting for the answer. This is the part that tends to be misunderstood, both by the avoidant, who may interpret the stopping as a strategy, as a more sophisticated form of pursuit designed to produce a different result through the mechanism of apparent withdrawal, and by observers of the dynamic who want the story to have a particular shape. The shape where the empath stops chasing and the avoidant finally arrives and the connection becomes what it was always trying to be. That shape is possible. It does happen. There are dynamics where the empath's return to themselves becomes the catalyst for the avoidant's genuine reckoning, and the reckoning produces real change, and the real change eventually produces the kind of relationship that both people were, in their different ways and with their different capacities, always trying to build. But the empath who has genuinely stopped chasing is not oriented toward that possibility in the way that hope tends to orient a person. They are not performing non-pursuit in the anticipation of a specific outcome. They are not strategically withdrawing their attention while internally monitoring the avoidance response to the withdrawal. They are not, in any meaningful sense, still organized around the avoidant at all. They are organized around themselves, around the life that opened up when the energy that was being directed outward came home, around the discovery, which tends to arrive with something between relief and grief, the grief being for the time that passed while the energy was elsewhere, that the interior they return to is extraordinarily worth inhabiting. There is a particular quality of aliveness that returns to the empath when the chase ends. It does not arrive all at once. It comes in installments, the way recovery tends to come. In moments of unexpected lightness, in the gradual return of interests and appetites, and the particular pleasure of one's own company that chronic relational anxiety tends to suppress. In the rediscovery of what it feels like to move through a day without the low-grade monitoring of someone else's emotional temperature as the background condition of every hour. The empath had been, for the duration of the dynamic, running a constant background process, a perpetual low-level scanning of the avoidance availability, their warmth, their distance, their particular quality of presence or absence on any given day. That scanning consumed resources, real, significant, ongoing resources that the empath system had been quietly depleting in service of a process that returned very little of practical value. When the scanning stops, when the empath is no longer organized around the question of where the avoidant is on the spectrum between present and distant today, the resources that were maintaining that process become available for other things. And the empath, who was always extraordinary in their capacity for depth and perception and genuine human engagement, discovers what that capacity looks like when it is fully available to their own life, rather than partially conscripted into the management of someone else's. It looks like flourishing, quietly, genuinely, without performance or announcement. The empath begins to flourish in the way that anything flourishes when the conditions that were suppressing it are finally removed. Not dramatically, organically, from the inside out. The avoidant notices this. Whatever distance exists between them, physical, relational, the distance of a connection that has gone quiet, or formally ended or simply changed its quality in ways that both people feel without necessarily naming. The avoidant notices the change in the empath's energy with the particular acuity of someone whose system has been attuned to that specific person for long enough to register the shift. Something is different. The quality of the empath's orientation has changed in a way that is not simply the absence of pursuit. It is not the empath waiting with patient strategic distance for the avoidant to come forward. It is something more complete than that. More genuinely turned away, more actually elsewhere. The empath's attention, which was for so long the most consistently present thing in the avoidance relational experience, which was there even in the absence, even in the distance, even in the silence after the avoidance withdrawal, that attention is no longer directed here. And the avoidant, feeling its redirection with a precision that surprises them, discovers something about what the attention meant to them that they could not access while it was reliably available. It was, without being named as such, a form of home. Not home in the way that actual security feels like home, not the settled, restful, genuinely safe version of that word, but home in the sense of a known location, a place their nervous system had learned to find without effort, a consistent point of warmth that they could remain at a chosen distance from, while still knowing, with the certainty that the empath's consistency provided, that it was there. It is no longer there in that way, and the avoidance nervous system, which has been navigating by it without acknowledging that navigation, suddenly has to recalibrate. The recalibration is not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable, not because the empath had engineered discomfort as an outcome, but because genuine recalibration rarely is. When a system that has been organized around a particular set of conditions encounters the sustained removal of those conditions, the adjustment is real and it has real sensation, real weight. The specific disorientation of someone whose habitual landscape has shifted in ways they cannot immediately compensate for. The avoidant may not identify what they are feeling as grief. They may not have the vocabulary or the self-access to name it accurately in real time. It may present as restlessness, as a vague dissatisfaction with the uncomplicated connections that were always available and always insufficient, as an increased awareness of the particular hollowness of dynamics that ask nothing genuine and return nothing genuine in kind. But underneath whatever name they give it or fail to give it, what is moving through the avoidant is grief, the real kind, for the real thing, for the specific irreplaceable quality of what was available and what the fear, running louder than the love, chose to move away from. Here is what the avoidant discovers in that grief, if they stay with it rather than immediately converting it into the familiar motion of seeking a replacement dynamic or drowning it in the noise of deliberate distraction. What they discover, sitting in the actual feeling of the actual loss, is that the empath did not simply love them in the ordinary sense of the word. The empath saw them, accurately, without the flattering distortions that projection and idealization tend to apply to people in the early stages of connection, without the convenient blind spots that most people maintain in the interest of keeping a dynamic comfortable, the empath saw the defended parts, the fearful parts, the parts that were not performing adequately and knew it, the parts that wanted more than they could ask for and took less than they were offered, because asking and receiving both required a vulnerability that the architecture consistently prevented. The empath saw all of it, and stayed, and reached, and loved, with a particular quality of love that genuine empathy produces, love that is not contingent on the performance of health, love that extends toward the wound as well as the strength. Love that is patient with imperfection, not because it lacks standards, but because it has enough depth to hold the full complexity of a person without requiring them to be simple. The avoidant lost that, and in the grief of having lost it, they finally feel the full weight of what it was. The empath does not know this, necessarily, does not have a live feed of the avoidant's interior reckoning, does not receive reports on the grief, the recalibration, the dawning recognition of what was present and what was done with it. And importantly, crucially, the empath who has genuinely returned to themselves is not organized around knowing it. They are not checking, not monitoring, not maintaining the low-level vigilance of someone who has withdrawn their pursuit, while still tracking the pursuit for signs that the withdrawal is producing the desired effect. The empath has moved, not away from the avoidant with the deliberate force of someone creating distance as a statement, but forward, in the direction of their own life, their own becoming, their own unfolding into the full version of themselves that the dynamic was always slightly compressing. And that movement, genuine, interior, not performed for an audience of one, is the most powerful thing the empath has ever brought to the dynamic. More powerful than the love, which was extraordinary. More powerful than the patience, which was remarkable. More powerful than the quality of seeing that the empath offered, which was rare. Because the love and the patience and the seeing were all in their way still organized around the avoidant, still directed outward, still spending the empath's remarkable resources on someone who was not yet in a position to receive them at the level they were being offered. The movement is different. The movement is the empath finally, fully, spending those resources on themselves, investing the depth and the care and the extraordinary quality of presence in the one relationship that was always guaranteed to return the investment, the relationship with their own life. Everything changes when that investment shifts, not because the external circumstances change dramatically or immediately, but because the internal orientation changes completely. And internal orientation is in the end the thing that determines what a person attracts, what they tolerate, what they build, and what they walk away from. The empath who is organized around themselves, genuinely, not as a posture, is a different gravitational field than the empath who was organized around the avoidant. They move differently. They engage differently. They bring a different quality of presence to every interaction, not because they have become colder or more guarded, or less capable of the depth that was always their natural register, but because that depth is now resourced, nourished, sustainable, coming from a full place rather than the increasingly depleted place that chronic one-directional giving eventually produces. And what that fullness attracts is correspondingly different. The connections that come toward a person who is genuinely full, genuinely inhabiting themselves, genuinely available to their own life without the distortion of a dynamic that had been consuming their attention. Those connections have a different quality than the connections that arrive when a person is organized around someone else's availability. They arrive without the dramatic charge of the avoidant dynamic, without the intensity that is, in retrospect, largely the intensity of anxiety rather than the intensity of genuine depth. Without the intoxicating and exhausting uncertainty that kept the empath's nervous system in a constant low-level state of alert, they arrive with something quieter, something that the empath freshly returned to themselves may initially mistake for a lack of chemistry, because it does not produce the familiar activation, but which, given enough time and enough honest attention, reveals itself as something considerably more valuable than activation. It reveals itself as ease, as the particular unfamiliar, gradually wonderful experience of being in the presence of someone whose presence does not require management, who shows up without the careful rationing of warmth, who stays without the constant monitoring for exit conditions, who meets depth with depth, not because they are performing depth, but because they have done enough of their own interior work to actually have access to it. The empath deserves that ease, not as a consolation prize for surviving a difficult dynamic, not as the lesser, quieter alternative to the intensity that the avoidant produced, but as the genuine expression of what love actually feels like when both people are actually present in it. Not the love that requires one person to carry the weight of two, not the love that survives on hope and the occasional unguarded moment when the avoidant's defense relaxed enough for something real to briefly exist between them. Not the love that is really, underneath its genuine warmth and genuine depth, a project, an ongoing, effortful, energy-consuming project of trying to reach someone who keeps choosing the distance. But love as a shared condition, as the natural expression of two people who have both done enough of their own work to arrive in each other's presence without the fear running everything, who can be close without the closeness activating alarm, who can be fully seen without the seeing producing the compulsion to retreat, who can build something together with both people actually holding the weight, actually showing up, actually choosing the thing again and again, not because the alternative is feared, but because the thing itself is genuinely sustainably wanted. That is what waits on the other side of the stopping. Not immediately, not without the grief of the transition, the disorientation of the recalibration, the strange and temporary emptiness of a self that is learning to be organized around its own life after a prolonged period of being organized around someone else's availability. But genuinely, really, with the particular solidity of something that was always going to be there once the path to it was cleared. The empath stopped chasing, and in stopping, made space for the only thing that was always worth arriving at. Themselves, first, fully, without apology or diminishment or the subtle ongoing editing that the dynamic had slowly been asking for. And from that fullness, from that genuine, inhabited, resourced return to the self that the avoidant never quite managed to dismantle despite the considerable pressure the pattern applied, everything else becomes possible. Not everything the empath hoped for inside the dynamic, but everything worth actually having outside of it, which turns out, in the clarity that follows the fog, to be considerably more than the dynamic was ever going to allow them to reach. The empath, in the weeks and months that follow the stopping, undergoes something that does not have an adequate name in ordinary language. It is not healing in the way that word tends to be used, implying the restoration of a previous state, the return to a before. Because the empath who emerges from the other side of this is not the person who entered it. That person is not recoverable, not because they were destroyed, but because they were surpassed. What happens is closer to integration. The slow, nonlinear, sometimes uncomfortable process of taking everything the dynamic produced, the clarity it forced, the self-knowledge it excavated, the specific education of having loved at full capacity in an insufficient space, and incorporating it into a self that is now larger than it was before. Not harder, not more defended, not organized around the prevention of future pain in the way that tends to produce the very emotional unavailability the empath spent so long on the other side of. Larger, more complete, more fully in possession of its own territory. The empath knows things now that cannot be unknown. About themselves, about love, about the specific difference between genuine connection and the compelling simulation of it that avoidant dynamics tend to produce in their most intense phases. About the way their own empathic capacity, that extraordinary sensitivity, that ability to feel another person's interior with almost their own precision, can become, without adequate self-referencing, a vector for self-loss rather than a pathway to genuine intimacy. That last understanding is perhaps the most significant one, because the empath's sensitivity is genuinely extraordinary, and it is also, without the accompanying practice of directed inward attention, genuinely vulnerable to a particular kind of depletion. The sensitivity does not discriminate automatically between what deserves its full attention and what is simply consuming it. It responds to emotional complexity the way a sophisticated instrument responds to signal, with full engagement, with a complete orienting of its considerable capacity toward the source of the complexity. And the avoidant is extraordinarily complex. The defended interior, the layered contradictions, the simultaneous presence and absence, the real feeling running underneath the managed surface, all of it produces a signal that the empath's sensitivity finds almost involuntarily compelling. Not because the empath is drawn to unavailability in some self-destructive way, though that narrative gets applied too readily and too reductively to people in this dynamic, but because genuine complexity, genuine depth, even when that depth is expressing itself primarily as defended pain, is the natural domain of the empathic capacity. The empath was not wrong to find the avoidant interesting. They were not wrong to sense the depth beneath the surface. They were not wrong to love what they perceived in the unguarded moments. The perception was accurate. The depth was real. What required recalibration was not the sensitivity, but the question of what the sensitivity was in service of. In service of the avoidant, the sensitivity became exhausting, because the avoidant's interior, however genuinely deep, however real the longing and the fear and the contradictory wanting, was not organized around the empath's well-being, was not a space that returned the perception with care, was not a place that the empath's full attunement could land and find something genuinely nourishing waiting on the other side of the attention. In service of the empath's own life, the sensitivity becomes something else entirely. It becomes the extraordinary asset it always was, functioning in the conditions it actually requires to function well. Conditions where the depth it perceives is reciprocal, where the complexity it engages is the productive kind, the complexity of two full people genuinely navigating genuine intimacy, rather than the consuming kind, the complexity of one person perpetually trying to reach another who keeps the distance carefully maintained. The empath begins to feel the difference, not as an intellectual distinction, but as a somatic one, as the specific, physical, undeniable difference between extending attention into a space that returns it with warmth and extending attention into a space that absorbs it without acknowledgement. Between the sustainable energy of genuine reciprocity and the chronic depletion of consistent one-directional giving, the body knows, it has always known. The empath, finally quiet enough to hear it, begins to listen. There is a grief that moves through this phase that is worth naming carefully. Not the grief of the loss itself. That grief arrived earlier, in the acute phase of the stopping, in the immediate aftermath of the turning inward. This is a different grief, slower, more reflective, the grief of retrospective clarity. The empath begins, in the spaciousness of their return to themselves, to see the dynamic with a completeness that was not possible from inside it, to see not just what the avoidant was doing and why, but what they themselves were doing and why. The places where the chasing was genuinely about love, and the places where it was about something older, something that predated the avoidant, that had its own history in the empath's particular formation, that the dynamic was not creating so much as activating, because the empath did not arrive in this dynamic without their own history, their own early experiences of love and its conditions, of attunement and its inconsistencies, of the specific ways in which sensitivity was either honored or exploited in the environments where it first developed. And those experiences, like all formative experiences, left their own traces in how the empath subsequently navigated intimacy, their own grooves that certain dynamics could find and run in. The avoidant dynamic found some of those grooves, and the empath, in the clarity of the aftermath, can feel where, can trace the specific ways in which the familiar texture of reaching towards someone emotionally unavailable resonated, however uncomfortably, with something already known, something already practiced, something that felt at the level of the nervous system rather than the conscious mind, like the recognizable shape of love. This is not a comfortable recognition. It does not arrive as accusation. The empath is not being blamed for the dynamic, is not being held responsible for the avoidance behavior, is not being told that their sensitivity or their history made them culpable for what the pattern produced. But it arrives as invitation, as the particular invitation of genuine self-knowledge, which always asks, now that you can see this, what do you choose to do with the seeing? The empath who engages honestly with that invitation does something that changes not just their relationship patterns, but their entire relationship with their own sensitivity. They begin the work, gentle, patient, genuinely compassionate toward themselves in the way they were always compassionate toward others, of understanding the difference between empathy as a way of being and empathy as a way of disappearing into someone else, between sensitivity that stays rooted in the self and sensitivity that detaches from the self in the direction of the other, between the capacity to feel another person's interior and the habit of prioritizing that interior over one's own, between love as the expression of genuine fullness and love as the expression of a self that has not yet learned to place its own needs in the category of things that deserve consistent, non-negotiable attention. The empath has always been extraordinary at caring for others, at perceiving what is needed and moving toward it, at extending warmth into spaces that were cold and light into spaces that were dark, and patience into spaces that were demanding it in the form of inconsistency and unavailability. The frontier, the actual growing edge that this dynamic for all its cost was pointing toward, is the application of that same quality of care to the self. the extension of the same generous, perceptive, genuinely loving attention inward. Not as self-indulgence, not as the overcorrection of someone who has been hurt and is now building walls against future hurt, but as the simple, fundamental, long overdue recognition that the self is also a space that deserves to be seen clearly and loved without conditions, and tended with the same consistency that was extended outward for so long. The empath learning to do that, learning to be as present to their own needs, their own boundaries, their own interior weather, as they were to the avoidance, is not a closing, it is an opening. The opening of a relationship with the self that has the same qualities as the relationships the empath has always been capable of building with others. Deep, honest, patient with imperfection, unwilling to abandon what it has chosen. Something shifts in the world around the empath as this internal relationship develops. Not in a mystical sense, not as the universe responding to alignment or energy attracting its equivalent, though those frameworks exist and have their own truth in the experiential sense, but in the concrete, observable, entirely explicable sense that a person who is genuinely present to themselves moves through the world differently than a person who is perpetually organized around someone else's needs. They make different decisions, not because they have adopted a new decision-making framework or committed to a set of rules about what they will and will not accept, but because the information that was always available, the felt sense of what is nourishing and what is depleting, what is reciprocal and what is consuming, what is building towards something and what is running in place, is now actually being consulted, is being treated as legitimate data rather than as something to be overridden by the hope that the dynamic will eventually become what it was being asked to become. The empath begins to trust their own perception in a way that the dynamic had been quietly undermining. Because one of the less visible costs of loving an avoidant, one of the effects that tends to accumulate gradually and become significant before it is noticed, is the erosion of perceptual confidence. When someone's behavior consistently contradicts their stated or implied feelings, when the warmth is real but the availability is not, when the connection is genuine in some moments and managed in others, the person trying to navigate that inconsistency begins to doubt their own reading of situations. They begin to wonder whether what they felt was real, whether the connection they perceived was as genuine as it seemed, whether their sensitivity is actually accuracy or actually wishful projection, whether the depth they thought they were in the presence of was truly there or was something they were partly constructing from the raw material of their own desire for it to exist. That doubt, that specific, insidious, gradually accumulating doubt about the validity of one's own perception, is one of the most significant things the empath recovers when they stop chasing and come home to themselves. Not through an act of will, not through the conscious decision to trust themselves again, but through the gradual accumulation of evidence in the quieter space of the return to self that the perception was accurate all along. The depth was real, the connection was real, the longing in the avoidant was real, the moments of genuine contact were real. The empath was not constructing, was not loving a fiction. What was also real was the limitation, the incapacity, the pattern that ran louder than the feeling, and the empath's perception of that was accurate too. The felt sense that something was consistently insufficient, that the warmth kept being rationed, that the arrival kept being deferred. That perception was not neediness or insecurity, or the anxious misreading of a person who was actually fine and available and being mischaracterized. It was accurate. The empath was seeing clearly the entire time. And the doubt that the dynamic introduced, the quiet persistent suggestion that the problem was the empath's perception rather than the dynamic's reality, that doubt was the most unjust cost of all. Because the empath's perception is not the problem. It never was. It is, in fact, the gift. The specific, rare, genuinely remarkable gift of someone who can feel the texture of what is real in a dynamic without the usual protective distance that most people maintain between themselves and the full weight of what intimacy actually involves. That gift, properly resourced, held by a self that is also attending to its own needs, grounded in a self-knowledge that does not waver in the face of someone else's inconsistency, directed by the empath's own genuine values rather than the perpetual responsiveness to another person's state. That gift is the foundation of the deepest kind of connection available between two human beings. Not the avoidant dynamic, not the particular intensity of loving someone whose fear is louder than their love, not the compelling but ultimately consuming experience of being the more present person in a connection that required two fully present people to become what it had the potential to be. But the other kind, the kind the empath is now, having stopped chasing and returned to themselves, and done the quiet, unglamorous, genuinely transformative work of integrating everything the dynamic produced, positioned to recognize and receive and build. The kind where the sensitivity is met with sensitivity, where the depth is met with depth, where the capacity for genuine presence is returned with genuine presence, not perfectly, not without the ordinary friction of two real people in actual contact, but consistently, as the baseline. As the thing that does not require maintenance because it is not a performance, it is simply who both people are when they show up fully. The empath has always been capable of that kind of connection, has always carried within them the specific quality of presence that makes it possible. The dynamic with the avoidant was not evidence to the contrary. It was the particular misdirection of an extraordinary capacity toward an insufficient space. The space is different now. The empath made it different, not by finding a new person or a new dynamic or a new external circumstance that resolved the old one, by doing the internal work that changed the landscape entirely, by stopping, by returning, by choosing, with the full weight of everything they had become through the experience, to be the person their own life had always deserved. That choice does not guarantee a particular outcome, does not promise a specific person or a specific connection or the neat resolution of all the complexity that genuine intimacy involves. What it does is something more fundamental than any of those things. It restores the empath to themselves, fully, without reservation, without the lingering orientation toward someone who could not meet them. And from that restoration, from that genuine hard-won, completely inhabited return to the self, everything that is actually meant for them becomes possible. Not someday. Now. In the life that was always happening, even during the chasing. In the self that was always worth choosing, even when the choosing was directed elsewhere. The empath is home. And home, it turns out, was never the avoidant. It was always this.